Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is in your part of the world right now, because tonight's story begins with a woman who once had everything, lost almost all of it, and still carried herself with more dignity than the people who tried to break her. When Eleanor Whitmore stood in front of the long mirror in her quiet London townhouse that autumn morning, she did not see the grand woman society columns had once adored. She saw a widow with steady hands, a straight back, and a face that had learned how to survive disappointment without asking anyone for pity. At 68, Eleanor still possessed a natural elegance that no amount of grief had managed to erase, though sorrow had softened the brightness in her eyes. Her silver blonde hair was arranged neatly at the nape of her neck, and the navy dress she wore was simple, expensive, and 10 years out of fashion. It suited her perfectly. On the bed behind her rested a cream-colored envelope embossed with the insignia of the cruise line. Mediterranean Anniversary Voyage, it read in gold lettering. 7 nights, private gala dinners, distinguished guests, a celebration of luxury. Vanessa had made sure the invitation looked lavish enough to impress anyone who saw it. Eleanor picked it up with 2 fingers as though it were something fragile and unpleasant at once. Her housekeeper, Miriam, hovered by the bedroom door. "You still don't have to go, Mrs. Whitmore." Eleanor gave a faint smile. "I know. Then why are you going?" That was a more difficult question than it should have been. For several seconds, she said nothing. She turned the envelope over, running her thumb along the sealed edge. "Because if I refuse, Vanessa will tell everyone I am bitter and unstable. If I attend, she will have to look me in the face." Miriam frowned. "That woman has never looked you in the face, not properly." Eleanor let out a quiet breath that could almost have been a laugh. "No, she looks at me the way people look at furniture they want removed." It had not always been this way. There had been a time when the name Whitmore meant something built, not inherited. Eleanor remembered the early years so clearly that sometimes they came to her stronger than the present. She and her late husband, Charles Whitmore, had once lived in a 1-bedroom flat above a bakery in Southampton, where the walls sweated in the winter and the pipes groaned through the night. Charles had worked the docks by day and studied freight schedules, contracts, and routes by lamplight. Eleanor had kept the books at the kitchen table, balancing columns while Daniel, their only child, slept in a basket lined with old blankets. They had built their first company from courage, sleeplessness, and a reckless kind of belief. Charles knew ships, Eleanor knew people. When clients hesitated, it was Eleanor who calmed them. When money vanished, it was Eleanor who found a way to stretch what remained. When competitors laughed at the idea that a woman could sit in meetings about maritime financing, Eleanor smiled and remembered every word they said. 10 years later, the same men shook her hand and called her formidable. But success had a strange way of changing the very people it was meant to protect. Charles died 12 years before this story began, not by one dramatic illness, but by a long, humiliating decline that reduced a powerful man into someone who could no longer button his own shirt without help. Eleanor had cared for him herself as long as she could. Daniel had visited, yes, but not often. He had been climbing, expanding, networking, becoming the polished heir everyone expected him to be. He cried sincerely at the funeral. Eleanor never doubted that. But after the funeral came the lawyers, the trustees, the advisory meetings, the discussions about transition, and somewhere inside that machinery, Daniel began to drift away from the boy who once brought his mother daisies pulled from other people's gardens. Then came Vanessa. Vanessa Mercer arrived in Daniel's life like a polished blade wrapped in silk. She was beautiful in the way magazines taught women to be beautiful. Sharp cheekbones, careful hair, a smile that appeared warm until one noticed it never reached her eyes. She had worked in luxury events and knew exactly how to flatter men who enjoyed being admired. Daniel, still carrying the grief of losing his father and the pressure of replacing him, fell for her quickly. At first, Eleanor tried. She truly did. She invited Vanessa to lunch, she gave her a pearl brooch that belonged to Charles's mother, she even defended her when older relatives complained she was too calculating. We must not judge a young woman for being ambitious. Eleanor had said then. Later, she would wonder whether that had been the moment she mistook hunger for strength. By the second year of Daniel and Vanessa's marriage, Eleanor noticed subtle shifts. Meetings she once attended were rescheduled without her. Family decisions were made after the fact. Trustees stopped calling her directly. Daniel assured her none of it was personal. "You should rest more, Mother," he told her one afternoon in his glass-walled office overlooking the Thames. "You've done enough for all of us." "I am not asking to be carried upstairs, Daniel," she replied. "I am asking why my name was removed from the foundation letterhead." He loosened his tie and looked at his screen instead of her. "It was branding. Vanessa thinks a modern image would help." "Vanessa thinks?" "She understands presentation." Eleanor stared at him for a long moment. "And you?" That was the thing about Daniel. He rarely shouted. He rarely insulted. He simply surrendered one piece at a time, one tradition, one loyalty, one boundary, until the surrender itself became his character. Still, Eleanor kept quiet more often than she wanted. Part of it was exhaustion, part of it was grief, and part of it was love, that humiliating, undisciplined love a mother can still feel for a son who no longer deserves the easiest parts of it. She had not signed away everything, of course. Eleanor had been too intelligent for that. Years earlier, during a reorganization Charles insisted upon after a shipping dispute nearly ruined one of their routes, certain protections had been placed in legacy holdings, trust structures, and old maritime agreements. Daniel knew some of this. Vanessa knew only enough to resent that Eleanor still carried quiet significance. But Eleanor never flaunted it. She had no appetite for power games. What she wanted, foolishly perhaps, was peace. Instead, she got performance. The cruise was Vanessa's latest masterpiece of image management. It was meant to celebrate her and Daniel's 10th anniversary, though everyone knew the real purpose was visibility. Influential investors would be aboard, society names, 2 members of a European Trade Council, a retired judge and his wife, a magazine editor. Vanessa curated the guest list the way a director cast a stage drama. 3 days before departure, Daniel came to visit Eleanor in person, something he had not done alone in months. He arrived in a camel coat that probably cost more than Charles's first car. "You look well," he said after kissing her cheek. "And you look worried." He gave a strained smile. "It's business, nothing more." She poured tea into the good china she no longer used for anyone else. Business that requires a luxury anniversary cruise. Vanessa thinks it will be good for optics. There is that word again, optics. Daniel sat, then stood again, then moved toward the fireplace. "Mother, can we not do this today?" "Do what?" "This tone." "My tone?" asked Eleanor softly. "Daniel, if my tone unsettles you more than your own decisions, then I'm afraid life has made you very delicate." He closed his eyes for a moment. "Why must every conversation become a test?" "Because every time I see you, you speak like a representative, not a son." The words landed harder than she intended. For a moment, he looked almost young again, almost wounded. Then the mask returned. "I came because Vanessa and I want you there," he said. Eleanor studied him. "Is that true?" "Yes." "No," she said, shaking her head once. "You came because people would notice if I were absent." He did not answer. That silence told her everything. Still, she agreed to go. Not because Vanessa deserved the satisfaction, not because Daniel had earned forgiveness, but because Eleanor had spent too many years retreating gracefully while lesser people rewrote her place in her own family. She would attend, she would watch, and if humiliation came, she would endure it with the same poise that had carried her through widowhood, betrayal, and loneliness. The morning of departure, as a par took her toward the port, London fading behind rain-streaked windows, Eleanor opened an old leather folder she had almost left behind. Inside were copies of letters, trust summaries, and private notes Charles had once told her never to discard. "If they ever make you feel unnecessary," he had said long ago, smiling over his spectacles, "remember that quiet foundations hold up the tallest houses." At the port, the ship rose like a floating palace of glass and steel. Vanessa was already there, in a cream coat, one hand resting theatrically on Daniel's arm as photographers captured arriving guests. The moment Vanessa saw Eleanor step out of the car, her smile changed, not enough for strangers to notice, but enough for Eleanor to see the irritation beneath it. "There you are," Vanessa said brightly. "I was afraid you might cancel at the last minute." Eleanor handed her gloves to a porter before answering. "I would hate to disappoint you." Vanessa's mouth twitched. Daniel leaned in to kiss his mother's cheek, but he seemed distracted, glancing over his shoulder at a man in a navy suit waiting near the boarding area. "Everything all right?" Eleanor asked. "Of course," Daniel said too quickly. But Eleanor had lived too long among negotiations, debts, silences, and men who lied with polished voices. Daniel was troubled, Vanessa was performing, and around them, in the polished glamour of the ship's grand welcome, Eleanor felt the first unmistakable stirring of something darker approaching. She looked up at the towering vessel, then at her son, then at the woman who had turned marriage into a campaign. Whatever awaited her on that cruise, she understood one thing with perfect clarity. She was done pretending not to see it. Before we continue, tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is where you are, because this next part is the moment when quiet humiliation turns into the kind of shock no one aboard that ship would ever forget. The first afternoon on the cruise passed in a blur of polished surfaces, smiling attendants, and the artificial warmth of luxury that existed only because dozens of invisible people labored beneath it. Eleanor noticed everything. She noticed how the chandeliers in the reception hall had been arranged to reflect against mirrored columns and make the room appear even grander than it was. She noticed the couples in pressed linen and silk moving slowly with glasses of champagne in their hands as if they themselves were part of the decor. She noticed the way staff glanced quickly at name tags, faces, and cabins, sorting every passenger into a hierarchy before a single true word had been spoken. And she noticed, more than anything, how hard Vanessa was trying. Vanessa drifted through the ship like a woman auditioning for the role of aristocracy. Her cream dress changed at dinner, then again for cocktails, and by late afternoon she had already taken enough photographs to fill 3 society columns. She laughed too loudly at wealthy men's jokes, touched women's arms in false familiarity, and made sure to mention Daniel's surname whenever conversation threatened to move away from status. Daniel, for his part, seemed distracted from the moment they boarded. He followed Vanessa when required, smiled when necessary, and checked his phone whenever he thought no one was looking. More than once, Eleanor saw tension gather in his jaw as messages appeared on the screen. He always slipped the phone back into his pocket before anyone could ask. By the time the dinner bell sounded that evening, the ship had moved far enough from the port that the last hints of land were gone. The Mediterranean stretched around them in a darkening blue that turned silver wherever the dying sun caught it. Eleanor stood for a moment near a window before heading to dress, and for a brief, foolish instant, she let herself enjoy the sight. She had once traveled with Charles on vessels far less elegant than this one. In those days, even a clean cabin and a decent meal had felt like a reward. They would sit together on deck with coffee gone lukewarm and talk about routes, storms, and the future they were still inventing. For a few seconds, she could almost hear his voice beside her. Then Vanessa appeared. "There you are," she said, the brightness in her tone too polished to be sincere. "We've been looking for you." Eleanor turned. "Have you?" Vanessa smiled. "There's been a tiny issue with the cabin arrangements." Eleanor said nothing at first. She had learned that silence often forced a careless person to reveal more than they intended. Vanessa continued, "The ship is completely full, and there seems to have been some confusion in the suite categories. Daniel and I, of course, must remain in the anniversary suite because the reception tomorrow is tied to that booking. Of course, Eleanor said quietly. Daniel arrived just then, as if summoned by the discomfort itself. Mother, it's only for tonight. There's been some administrative error. They'll sort it out. Eleanor looked from one face to the other. And where exactly do you intend for me to sleep tonight? Vanessa gave a little sigh, as though the matter were tiresome rather than insulting. It's not ideal, but there are staff quarters below deck. Very clean, I'm told. Perfectly adequate for one night.
For a heartbeat, Eleanor thought she must have misheard. Around them, passengers passed in slow currents toward the grand dining room. A violin trio played near the staircase. Crystal glassware caught the light. Everything on the surface remained elegant. Yet, beneath that elegance, something ugly had just been spoken aloud. Eleanor's eyes settled on Vanessa's face. "You are telling me to sleep in the servants' quarters." Vanessa lowered her voice, but not enough. "Please don't phrase it so dramatically." "Then give me a better phrase." Daniel stepped forward. "Mother, let's not make this public." That hurt more than Vanessa's insult. Not because he had agreed with his mother, that pain had become familiar, but because his first instinct was not outrage for his mother, but fear of embarrassment for himself. Eleanor looked at him steadily. "Public? Daniel, she has just told your mother to sleep below deck like an inconvenience that wandered into the wrong part of the ship." His face reddened. "I said it's temporary." Vanessa's tone sharpened, a crack in the polished mask. "Must everything become a moral performance with you? We are trying to manage a delicate situation." Eleanor nearly laughed then, though there was no humor in it. "A delicate situation? No, Vanessa, a delicate situation is a storm warning or illness or a death telegram at sea. This is simple cruelty dressed in good tailoring." A passing couple slowed. A nearby steward kept his eyes lowered, but could not hide that he had heard. Vanessa saw it too, and her expression hardened. "If you intend to create a scene on the first evening, perhaps the lower deck is best after all." Daniel whispered, "Vanessa," but she had already committed herself. The meanness was out now, and once people like Vanessa crossed that line, they rarely stepped back. They pushed further instead, counting on other people's shame to protect them. Eleanor drew herself up, not dramatically, but with the calm posture of a woman who had survived worse than humiliation. "You needn't worry," she said. "I will not shout. I will not weep. I will not beg for a room on a ship where my own son has invited me as decoration." Daniel flinched. A silence passed among the three of them, taut as wire. Then Vanessa turned to a steward standing several paces away. "Please escort Mrs. Whitmore downstairs," she said. "Somewhere quiet." The steward hesitated. It was brief, but Eleanor noticed it. So did Vanessa. "There's no problem, is there?" Vanessa asked. "No, madam," he replied at once, though his voice had changed. He glanced at Eleanor again, then at the manifest tablet in his hand, as if checking something he suddenly no longer trusted himself to assume. Eleanor caught that look. Not fear exactly, recognition perhaps, or uncertainty, but she chose not to dwell on it yet. "Very well," she said, and lifted her chin. "Lead the way." Daniel took a half step toward her. "Mother." She stopped him with a look so steady that his words died unspoken. "Do not follow me unless you intend to act like a son." The steward guided her away from the golden glow of the reception level and toward a side corridor used mostly by staff. With every turn, the music softened behind them. The carpets became plainer, the walls narrower. The polished illusion of luxury gave way to the machinery that supported it. Eleanor walked without complaint. If the steward expected tears or outrage, he got neither. But she did notice the subtle shifts around her. Twice, crew members looked at her name on the steward's tablet and then at her face with visible surprise. One engineer, stepping out of a maintenance access hatch, actually paused long enough to stare. "Is something wrong?" Eleanor asked at last. He looked uneasy. "No, madam, I'm sure it's nothing."
That is not an answer. He swallowed. Some of the senior crew are verifying details. What details? I'm not liberty to say. There it was again, that undercurrent of tension she had sensed since boarding. Not simple confusion, not mere awkwardness. Something else. They were 2 decks below the guest suites when it happened. First came a shudder beneath her feet, strong enough to rattle the metal trim along the corridor walls. Then the lighting flickered once, twice, before holding steady. A second later, the low, continuous vibration of the engines vanished. The sudden silence was more frightening than noise. The ship did not crash, it did not tilt violently, but it slowed in a way that every human body could feel, a massive living thing abruptly checked mid-breath. Somewhere above them came the muffled sound of startled voices, a dropped tray, a woman gasping, footsteps breaking into nervous movement. The steward froze. "Stay here, please."
"What has happened?" Eleanor asked. Before he could answer, the ship gave another deep tremor as systems adjusted. This time, distant alarm tones sounded briefly and then cut off, replaced by a clipped voice over internal crew radio farther down the corridor. Passengers had begun spilling into hallways above. Eleanor could hear it now. Doors opening, confused conversation, the rising tremor of fear that spreads fastest in enclosed luxury. Wealth did not make people calmer in a crisis. Often it made them worse. A moment later, the public address system crackled to life. At first, there was only static, then the captain's voice, controlled, formal, but undeniably strained. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Henry Beaumont speaking. Please remain calm. There is no immediate danger to the vessel. We are conducting a temporary operational hold." In the corridor, crew members were suddenly moving with purpose. Then the captain spoke again, and this time every word landed like a struck bell. "Would Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore please identify herself immediately?" The steward turned so sharply he nearly dropped the tablet in his hand. Eleanor stood motionless. Above them, the noise from the passenger decks changed. Confusion gave way to something sharper. Her name had traveled through the ship in an instant. The captain continued, more urgently now. "Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, if you can hear this announcement, please remain where you are. Senior officers are coming to you now." Footsteps pounded from both directions, not toward the anniversary suite, not toward Vanessa, not toward Daniel and his carefully managed image, toward the servant corridor, toward her. And for the first time that night, Eleanor saw fear, not on her own face, but on the faces of the crew who had just realized exactly who had been sent below deck. Before we continue, tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is in your country right now, because this part is where humiliation turns into revelation, and the woman they tried to send below deck is suddenly the one every officer on that ship is desperate to honor. For several long seconds after the captain's announcement, Eleanor did not move. The narrow service corridor around her seemed to hold its breath. The steward who had been leading her looked as though the floor might open beneath him at any moment. Farther down the passage, 2 crew members stopped in place, their eyes fixed on her with a mixture of confusion and dawning alarm. Somewhere above, through the layers of deck and steel, Eleanor could still hear the restless murmur of frightened passengers reacting to the ship's abrupt halt and to the strange public request for a woman most of them had barely noticed before dinner. The steward found his voice first. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, suddenly standing straighter than before. I am terribly sorry. I did not know." Eleanor kept her gaze on him. "No," she replied with quiet precision. "You did not." The apology was sincere, but it was not the one she wanted. Not from him. He had only obeyed an order. The true insult had been born elsewhere. Fast footsteps echoed through the corridor. Within moments, 3 senior officers appeared, followed by a woman in a dark navy uniform with gold piping at the shoulders.
She was in her 50s, perhaps, composed despite the urgency in her expression, and Eleanor recognized from her insignia that she was not ordinary crew, she was one of the executive officers. The woman stopped a few feet away. "Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore?" "I am Eleanor Whitmore." The officer exhaled, visibly relieved. Thank God. That response alone told Eleanor the situation was far more serious than a booking error or some sentimental link to an old family name. The officer stepped forward and inclined her head respectfully. "I am First Officer Celeste Moreau. The captain asks that you come with us immediately. There has been an issue requiring your direct confirmation." Eleanor's eyes narrowed slightly. What kind of issue requires a ship to stop in open water? The first officer hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "One related to vessel protocol and restricted legacy authority." Behind her, one of the younger officers cast a glance toward the steward standing by the wall. Shame passed over the steward's face again, deeper now. Eleanor understood why. The whole crew likely realized that while the ship's command was searching for her with urgency, she had been led toward staff accommodations like an unwanted burden. "What exactly is being confirmed?" Eleanor asked. The first officer lowered her voice. "Your identity, ma'am, and your standing under an old guarantor designation." The words reached back through years Eleanor had deliberately stopped revisiting. For a brief moment, she saw not the corridor, but a rainy office in Southampton nearly 4 decades earlier. Charles bent over draft papers while lawyers and lenders argued about exposure, liability, and emergency lines of credit. It had been one of the darkest periods in the early days of their expansion. A carrier line they depended on was collapsing. One unfinished vessel was tied to a financing package no bank wanted to touch. Charles had been told the entire venture might fail unless someone personally guaranteed the rescue arrangement. Charles had been ready to risk everything. Eleanor had been the one who understood the human pride in the room and turned a disaster into a negotiation. She remembered saying, "If you want our names, then write both of them. My husband built the roots, but I secured the confidence that kept them alive." One elderly maritime lender had laughed at first. By the end of the week, he signed. Eleanor blinked and returned to the present. "That designation cannot possibly still be active," she said. "It is," the first officer answered, "or at least parts of it are. That is why we must speak with you privately at once." Without another word, Eleanor allowed herself to be escorted. As they walked, the crew's behavior had transformed completely. Doors were opened before her. Instructions were spoken in clipped, deferential tones. No one treated her as an inconvenience now. They treated her like the answer to a question that had suddenly become dangerous. They took a restricted lift upward instead of the staff stairwell. When the doors opened on one of the upper decks, Eleanor stepped into a level far more refined than the one she had left behind. Wide carpets muted every footfall. Brass fixtures gleamed under warm light. At the far end of the corridor, 2 uniformed security officers stood outside a private lounge, reserved, no doubt, for command meetings or emergency consultations. As Eleanor answered, she saw Captain Henry Beaumont waiting beside a polished table strewn with open binders, a digital manifest display, and what looked like scanned copies of archival agreements. He was a distinguished man in his early 60s, silver-haired, dignified, and visibly under pressure. The moment he saw her, he came forward. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, and there was genuine respect in his tone. "I owe you an apology for the circumstances in which you were found." Eleanor met his eyes. "You owe me an explanation first." A shadow of grim agreement crossed his face. Quite right. He gestured toward a chair, but Eleanor remained standing. The captain understood and began at once. "Shortly after departure, our systems flagged a restricted passenger verification discrepancy linked to dormant legacy protections attached to this vessel's parent fleet. Your name triggered it. Under normal conditions, such archival flags remain inactive. Tonight, however, a confidential account review associated with the anniversary charter package activated an older chain of ownership and emergency authority records." Eleanor listened in silence. Captain Beaumont continued. This ship, though modernized and transferred through various companies, still belongs to a fleet line that survived a near collapse many years ago due to an emergency financing structure personally guaranteed by Whitmore Maritime Holdings. Not just Whitmore Maritime Holdings, by Charles and Eleanor Whitmore. The captain nodded once. Yes, ma'am, by both. The surviving legal notation specifies your name individually in one of the protected guarantor layers. That legacy designation intersects with certain command protocols in the event of flagged financial or operational irregularities. The moment your identity appeared in a mismatched cabin status review tied to restricted passenger categories, the system required direct command level verification. Eleanor looked at the documents on the table. Her maiden signature stared back from a scanned page in slanted blue ink, decades old and unmistakably hers. One of the officers added, "There are only 3 such personal guarantor records still connected to any vessel in the fleet. 2 belong to deceased parties. Yours remains active because no dissolution order was ever filed." Eleanor let out a soft breath. Because my husband and I never intended for opportunists to untangle what we tied together. Captain Beaumont studied her. He seemed to understand that the sentence was about more than contracts. So the ship was stopped because of me, because of your name, the captain answered, and because command could not proceed with the flagged sequence until your identity was confirmed. Once it became clear you were indeed aboard, protocol demanded immediate acknowledgement. I made the announcement myself. For the first time that evening, Eleanor felt not humiliation, but a strange, cold clarity. Vanessa had ordered her sent below deck as if she were socially disposable. Yet under the steel bones of the very ship Vanessa had used as a stage for prestige, Eleanor's name still possessed weight enough to halt engines, summon officers, and move authority. Life had an almost theatrical cruelty sometimes, but it also had irony. The captain's expression shifted subtly. There is another matter. Go on. When our system cross-referenced your boarding status with access tiers, it briefly placed your account under a dormant executive courtesy designation. That is why the review became urgent. In practical terms, Mrs. Whittemore, you were never supposed to have been sent anywhere except a senior hospitality suite pending verification. Eleanor gave the smallest of smiles. There was no triumph in it, only exhaustion. I see. The first officer spoke carefully. May I ask, ma'am, who directed that you be moved below deck? Eleanor did not answer immediately. She could have named Vanessa then. She could have described the insult in exact words and watched the officers recoil on her behalf. But some instinct in her held her still. Not mercy, not quite. Something colder and more useful. That can wait, she said. Captain Beaumont inclined his head, accepting the boundary. As you wish. A steward entered with tea on a silver tray, his hands noticeably unsteady. Eleanor nearly found the contrast absurd. Less than half an hour ago, she had been treated as excess family baggage. Now, senior crew hovered around her like diplomats around a state witness. When the door opened again, Daniel and Vanessa were standing outside. Vanessa's composure was still technically intact, but the skin around her mouth had tightened. Daniel looked pale, truly pale, as if something inside him had finally slipped beyond denial. The security officers glanced to the captain, waiting. Let them in, Eleanor said. They entered the lounge like people stepping into the wrong courtroom. Daniel began, then stopped when he saw the documents spread across the table and the posture of every officer in the room. Vanessa's gaze flicked from Eleanor to the captain and back again. What is going on? She asked. Her voice was controlled, but beneath it ran unmistakable fear. There was some kind of misunderstanding. Captain Beaumont answered before Eleanor could. There was no misunderstanding, madam. Mrs. Whittemore is directly named in legacy guarantor records associated with this vessel's parent line. Her identity required immediate command verification. Vanessa blinked. That's impossible. No, Eleanor said, turning toward her at last. "What is impossible, Vanessa, is that after all your research into appearances, wealth, invitations, and titles, you never thought to ask who helped build the world you were so eager to display." Daniel looked at her, shame rising visibly in his face. "Mother, I didn't know it would—" "No," Eleanor said, more softly this time. "You didn't know many things, Daniel. That has been your great convenience." Vanessa tried to recover. "If there was an error in the suite arrangements, then naturally we can correct it now." The room went very still. Eleanor heard the sentence for what it was. Not apology, not remorse, but strategy. Vanessa wanted to pull the evening back under her control, to behave as though this were merely an unfortunate clerical slip and not an act of calculated humiliation. Eleanor turned to the captain. "Is there another cabin available?" Captain Beaumont answered at once. "There is a premium suite on the upper deck, ma'am. It has been prepared for you." "Good," Eleanor said. Then she looked at Vanessa. "I will take that one." Vanessa opened her mouth, perhaps to object, perhaps to rearrange the humiliation into some fiction she could survive, but no words came. And in that silence, something inside Eleanor shifted. She did not feel vindicated, not yet. She did not feel healed, certainly not. But for the first time in years, she felt released from the burden of pretending the insults were small. The moment exposed everything too clearly for anyone to hide behind etiquette anymore. By the time she was escorted to her new suite, word had already traveled throughout the ship. Passengers stared, whispered, recalculated. The couple who had barely nodded at her before dinner now moved aside with sudden politeness. A retired investor from Marseille introduced himself with almost eager respect. An elegant elderly woman in emerald silk caught Eleanor's hand and said, "My dear, I remember your husband. He always said you were the sharper mind."
Eleanor thanked her with grace, but inside she was still listening to the echo of the engines stopping. When she entered the suite prepared for her, the balcony doors stood slightly open to the night air. The sea beyond was dark, endless, alive with scattered lights from the ship's reflection. On a small table rested a handwritten note from the captain expressing regret and requesting her presence for a private luncheon the following day. Nearby there was also a card from the investor couple who had recognized her name. They wished to speak about a maritime heritage foundation, it said, should she be willing. Eleanor set the cards down and moved to the balcony. Below, somewhere in the layers of steel and decks, the same ship continued its voyage, but nothing was as it had been before the stop. Not for Vanessa, not for Daniel, not for her. They had tried to send her beneath the surface, to tuck her away where no one important would see her. Instead, the whole vessel had learned her name. Before we continue, tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is in your part of the world, because this next part is where the truth stops hiding behind luxury and the woman they tried to disgrace finally begins to understand how deep the betrayal really goes. The morning after the ship stopped, Eleanor woke before sunrise. For a few seconds, she did not remember where she was. The suite was too spacious, too still, too polished to belong to the ordinary life she had built for herself in recent years. Then she saw the open balcony doors, heard the low, endless hush of the sea, and remembered everything at once. Vanessa's voice, Daniel's silence, the captain's announcement, the startled faces in the corridor, and the terrible clarity that had followed. She rose slowly, wrapped a robe around her shoulders, and stepped onto the balcony. The Mediterranean was pale blue and silver under the early morning light. Far off, another vessel moved like a white thread on the horizon. Eleanor rested both hands on the railing and breathed in the salt air. In the old days, Charles would have loved a morning like this. He used to say that ships at dawn looked honest, stripped of their theatrical glamour. At dawn, a vessel was not luxury, not status, not performance. It was simply steel, direction,
labor, and risk. "Everything becomes clearer at sea," he once told her. Standing there alone, Eleanor realized how true that had become. There was a knock at the door at 8:30. Breakfast arrived along with a sealed note from Captain Beaumont, politely renewing his invitation for a private luncheon and assuring her that the matter of the previous night had been handled at the highest level of ship protocol. Beneath the captain's note lay a second card, handwritten in an elegant, sloping hand. "Mrs. Whittemore, if you are willing, my husband and I would be honored to speak with you this afternoon. We knew Charles many years ago and have not forgotten the role your family played in preserving several working routes that kept many seafarers employed. We believe your experience would be invaluable to a project close to our hearts." It was signed Helena and Maurice Villette. Eleanor read the note twice. The name Villette stirred a distant recognition. Maurice Villette had once been tied to port investments in Marseille. Charles had respected him, though never entirely trusted his instincts. Helena, if Eleanor remembered correctly, had funded maritime hospitals and pension initiatives for crew families. The invitation was not social curiosity. It was something more serious. For the first time in a very long time, Eleanor felt a faint stirring of possibility unrelated to her son, her daughter-in-law, or the brittle architecture of family appearances. But before possibility came truth. By late morning, whispers had spread through the ship so thoroughly that Eleanor could feel them when she entered public spaces. People who had overlooked her the day before now greeted her with polished deference. Some were sincere, others were simply adjusting to new information the way wealthy passengers always did, by deciding whom it was safest to respect. Vanessa was nowhere to be seen at breakfast. Daniel appeared once from across the lounge, spotted his mother speaking with an elderly Belgian couple, and immediately turned away, as if he had stumbled into a room where he no longer knew the rules. Eleanor watched him go without calling him back. She was beginning to understand that silence could be more educational than confrontation. At noon, she met the Villettes in a private veranda lounge at the rear of the upper deck. Maurice Villette was broad-shouldered, white-haired, and moved with the careful stiffness of a man who had once been physically formidable and now negotiated with age rather than fighting it. Helena Villette was elegant in a cream silk blouse, with the calm gaze of a woman who had spent decades learning how to distinguish character from charm. The moment Eleanor approached, Helena took both her hands warmly. "My dear, it has been far too many years." Maurice inclined his head. "Charles would be furious if he knew how you were treated last night." Eleanor gave a small, humorless smile. "He would have been less diplomatic than I was." "That," Maurice said, "I can believe." They invited her to sit, and what began as courtesy quickly deepened into something more meaningful. Maurice spoke of how the industry had changed: consolidations, political pressures, the rise of spectacle over substance. Helena spoke of older crew families being forgotten by the very companies built on their sacrifices. Together, they described an idea they had been trying to develop: a maritime heritage and welfare trust that would preserve the histories of working seafarers, while also offering scholarships, emergency support, and small pensions for families long ignored by modern corporate structures. "We have money," Helena said plainly. "What we lack is a figure with lived authority, someone not chosen because she photographs well at fundraisers, but because she remembers what the industry actually cost people." Maurice looked at Eleanor with deliberate seriousness. "Your name still carries meaning in circles that do not care about society pages." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "You are asking a widow who was nearly tucked away like luggage last night to become useful again." "No," Helena replied gently. "We are asking a woman who has always been useful to stop allowing lesser people to decide whether she matters." The words pierced deeper than Helena probably intended. Eleanor lowered her gaze to the porcelain cup in front of her. She had spent so long narrowing her life, managing her expectations, and surviving insult with composure, that the idea of building something new felt almost dangerous. "I don't know whether I still have the strength," she said. Maurice gave a low grunt. "Strength is not your problem. Permission is." They spent over an hour talking. By the end of it, Eleanor had agreed to review preliminary plans after the voyage. Nothing formal, nothing grand, but something had begun. A line extending beyond the cruise, beyond Vanessa, beyond Daniel, beyond being the injured party in someone else's melodrama. When Eleanor left the luncheon, she found Daniel waiting near the glass doors leading back into the main corridor. He looked tired in a way expensive clothes could not hide. His tie had been loosened, there were faint shadows under his eyes. He gave the passing impression of a man who had not slept well, and perhaps had not truly rested in years. "May I speak with you?" he asked. "You are already speaking." His mouth tightened briefly. "Please, Mother." She studied him, then gestured toward a quieter alcove overlooking the water. Daniel did not begin at once. He stood with both hands braced on the rail, as if he needed the metal to steady himself. "I know what happened last night was indefensible." Eleanor said nothing. He went on. "Vanessa shouldn't have spoken to you that way." "And you?" Eleanor asked. "What should you have done?" Daniel stared at the sea. "I should have stopped it." "Yes." The single word landed heavily. He rubbed a hand over his face. "You think I know what I've become." "I think you know," Eleanor said. "I think you have simply preferred not to look directly at it." He turned toward her then, and for the first time in a long while, she saw more than polished weakness in him. She saw strain, fear, a man cornered by consequences he once told himself were temporary. "There are things you don't understand," he said quietly. "Then explain them." He hesitated. "Vanessa and I are under pressure." "That is a phrase used by cowards and publicists. Try again." Daniel let out a breath that trembled more than he intended. "Some investments went badly. We leveraged more than we should have. There were loans on expected returns. Events, property exposure, a hospitality venture in Monaco that collapsed. Vanessa kept insisting we only needed one more season, one more circle, one more partnership to recover." Eleanor listened without interrupting. "We couldn't appear weak, not publicly, not with the people we owe and the people watching. And so humiliating your widowed mother on a cruise ship was part of recovery?" "No," he said sharply, then lowered his voice. "No, it wasn't supposed to happen like that." "Then how was it supposed to happen?" He looked away again. Eleanor felt something cold settle in her chest. "Say it." Daniel's silence lasted too long. Finally, he spoke. "Vanessa believes that if the remaining legacy controls were simplified, we could stabilize everything." "Legacy controls," Eleanor repeated. "You mean the protections your father and I built?" "Yes, but—" "And what exactly did Vanessa propose doing about them?" Daniel swallowed. "She said some trustees consider you difficult to place, independent, unpredictable." Eleanor almost smiled at the cowardice of the phrasing. "Try honesty for once in your life." He closed his eyes. "She said if concerns were raised about your judgment, temporary oversight might be justified, just until things were settled." There it was. Not mere rudeness, not ordinary greed, something darker, colder, more deliberate. Eleanor stood very still. "You allowed your wife to discuss whether I should be declared mentally unfit?" Daniel opened his eyes immediately. "I didn't agree to it outright." "You did not need to. You stayed." "Mother!" "You stayed." He flinched as if struck. Eleanor's voice remained calm, and that calm frightened him more than anger would have. "Do you understand what that means? It means that while I was bereaving your father, simplifying my life, stepping back so you could lead, The two of you were discussing how to erase what remained of my standing entirely. Daniel's face had gone gray. It wasn't finalized. Nothing was done. No, Eleanor said, not because your conscience saved me, because your incompetence failed to complete it. That was when she saw movement at the end of the corridor. Vanessa. She was standing half hidden behind a decorative column, elegant as ever, but too still, listening. Eleanor met her gaze across the distance. Vanessa stepped forward with the smooth boldness of a woman who hated being caught, yet refused to show it. Perhaps, Vanessa said coolly, this is not the place for family scenes. Eleanor turned fully toward her. And yet you do your best work in public settings. Vanessa ignored that. Her attention shifted to Daniel, and in one quick glance, Eleanor saw the whole rotten structure of their marriage: pressure, vanity, dependence, fear. We need to speak privately, Vanessa said to him. No, Eleanor said before he could answer. You have already done enough speaking in private. Vanessa lifted her chin. If you're about to dramatize business matters into some emotional persecution, I suggest caution. Financial strain is not a crime. No, Eleanor replied, but calculated cruelty in service of financial ambition reveals character very efficiently. Vanessa's eyes flashed. You have always resented me. I underestimated you, Eleanor said. That is different. Vanessa folded her arms. You think one outdated maritime clause and a few sentimental admirers on this ship change anything? Eleanor stepped closer, not aggressively, but with the composed force of a woman who had finally stopped retreating. No, Vanessa, what changes everything is that I now see clearly what you are willing to do when your lifestyle trembles. Daniel looked from one woman to the other, like a man watching a bridge collapse under his own feet. That afternoon, Eleanor returned to her suite and made 3 decisions. First, she contacted her London solicitor through a secure satellite line provided discreetly by the captain. She requested immediate review of all surviving trust protections, oversight mechanisms, and any recent attempts to challenge her legal standing. Second, she asked that all communication regarding family assets, foundations, and trust governance be copied directly to her from that point forward. Third, she accepted the valet's invitation to review the Seafarer's Trust proposal after the voyage. By evening, her solicitor called back with troubling news. There had indeed been quiet maneuvering over recent months, informal inquiries, draft language, exploratory conversations around capacity review contingencies. Nothing finalized, as Daniel had said, but enough to prove intent. Eleanor thanked him, requested preservation of all records, and ended the call. She stood for a long time afterward in the gathering dusk, looking out over the sea. The pain was real, deeper than she had anticipated, but beneath it something else was forming. Not revenge, not yet, but structure, direction, purpose. Vanessa and Daniel had made one fatal mistake. They believed Eleanor's life could be reduced to whatever place they assigned her. They did not understand that the moment they tried to bury her, she began building a future beyond them. Before we continue to the final part, tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is in your part of the world, because this is the ending of a woman's long humiliation and the beginning of the life she should have been living all along. 6 months after the cruise, the sea no longer belonged to Eleanor Whitmore as a memory of betrayal. It belonged to her as a beginning. Spring had settled over the southern coast of Portugal, and the restored estate where Eleanor now lived overlooked a quiet harbor lined with whitewashed buildings, fishing boats, and a marina where working vessels sat beside polished yachts, as if the world were constantly trying to remind itself that real labor and decorative wealth would always exist side by side. The estate itself had once belonged to a retired shipping family, then sat empty for years before Helena and Maurice Villette helped Eleanor find it. It was not a palace. That was precisely why she loved it. The house had dignity instead of vanity. Stone walls held the coolness of morning. Blue shutters opened toward the sea. Wild rosemary grew along the back path, and gulls cried overhead at dawn. For the first time in many years, Eleanor's days were no longer shaped by waiting for her son to remember he had a conscience. She rose early, worked through correspondence for the Whitmore Seafarers Trust, met with legal and historical consultants, reviewed scholarship applications for children of crew families, and attended planning sessions for the first mobile emergency support vessel the trust intended to fund. She had become, to her own quiet surprise, busy again in the most meaningful sense, not socially occupied, not distracted, useful. And usefulness, when joined to dignity, could heal parts of a person grief had left hollow. The trust had grown more quickly than anyone expected. What began as an exploratory conversation aboard the cruise ship had become a formal institution within months. Helena oversaw fundraising strategy with elegant discipline. Maurice used his old industry ties to secure port partnerships and medical cooperation agreements. Eleanor became the public and moral center of the mission. Her name opened doors not because it glittered, but because it still meant something durable to the people who remembered how maritime life had once been built. In interviews, she spoke not about society, family scandal, or revenge, but about crews who vanished from history once the wealthy finished profiting from them. She spoke about widows who never understood the pension documents mailed to them. She spoke about injured engineers, stewards, cooks, and deckhands who spent decades keeping others afloat and then disappeared from institutional memory as if their bodies had never borne the weight of that labor. People listened. That, perhaps, was Vanessa's first true defeat. For a while after the cruise, Vanessa tried to contain the damage the way she handled everything else, through narrative. She told select acquaintances that Eleanor had become emotionally unstable during the voyage, and that the shipboard confusion had been magnified by age, grief, and old contractual misunderstandings. But polished lies struggle in the presence of documents, and unfortunately for Vanessa, documents had begun to surface. Eleanor's solicitor moved with patient precision. Copies of draft inquiries regarding capacity review were preserved. Financial structures Daniel and Vanessa had hoped no one would examine too closely were quietly reviewed by forensic advisors. The pressure was not theatrical. It was legal, methodical, and impossible to charm away. By winter's end, their world had started to crack. The Monaco hospitality venture had been propped up by borrowing against unstable future returns. Vanity properties purchased for impression rather than prudence were over-leveraged. Two private lenders who once tolerated delay became suddenly merciless when rumors spread that the Whitmore legacy was no longer guaranteed to shield Daniel's household from exposure. Invitations slowed. Friendly calls stopped. One magazine that had previously featured Vanessa in a Women of Distinction, Spread published a brief item weeks later about a luxury investment circle under scrutiny. It did not mention her by name, but everyone in her world knew how to read between the lines. Daniel, for the first time in his adult life, could not outrun consequences by looking respectable in a tailored suit. He tried to call Eleanor twice in the early months after the cruise. She did not answer, not out of pettiness, out of necessity. She had spent too many years allowing his unfinished remorse to interrupt her clarity. Instead, her solicitor informed him that all communication concerning trusts, assets, governance, or reputational claims would proceed through proper channels. Personal reconciliation, if ever possible, would not occur under pressure. Then, one mild afternoon in April, he came in person. Martha, Eleanor's new housekeeper in Portugal, entered the study with unusual hesitation. "There is a man at the gate asking for you, Señora. He says his name is Daniel Whitmore." Eleanor set down her glasses and remained still for a moment. Through the study window, she could see the harbor in the distance, bright under late sunlight. A younger version of herself might have felt panic. Another version might have rushed forward, hoping at last for the son she had once known. This Eleanor felt neither. "Did he come alone?" she asked. "Yes. Let him in." When Daniel entered the study 10 minutes later, the difference in him was visible immediately. He was still handsome in the worn way some men remain handsome even while life strips them of polish, but the assurance that had once coated him was gone. His coat was good, but not luxurious. His face had thinned. The old reflex to appear in control had deserted him. For several seconds, mother and son simply looked at one another. Then Daniel said, very quietly, "You look well." Eleanor did not invite him to sit. "I am well." He accepted the rebuke hidden in the simplicity of that answer. "I wasn't sure you'd see me." "I almost didn't." He nodded once, absorbing it. "I deserve that." "No," Eleanor said. "Deserving has very little to do with what people receive in families. That has always been the problem." Something in his expression broke then, not dramatically, but in the small, exhausted way of a man who no longer has energy left for self-deception. "Vanessa has left," he said. Eleanor's face did not change. "I see. She went to Geneva first, then Paris, I think. She's trying to salvage whatever can still be performed." The bitterness in his voice was not attractive. It was merely late. "And you?" Eleanor asked. "I stayed to deal with what was mine." "That is new." He gave a broken half-laugh. "Yes, it is." At last, she gestured toward a chair opposite her desk. He sat. She remained standing a moment longer, then took her own seat with deliberate calm, placing the desk between them. The symbolism was not lost on either of them. Daniel looked down at his hands. "I didn't come to ask for money." "Good, because none would be given." "I know. I came because I've run out of excuses." The room was quiet except for the distant sound of gulls and the faint ticking of a mantel clock. He continued, voice rougher now. "For years, I told myself I was managing things, balancing things, protecting the business, the marriage, the image, the future. I kept saying everything difficult was temporary. Every compromise, every silence, every time Vanessa crossed a line, I called it strategy. Every time I disappointed you, I called it necessity. I see now that I wasn't managing anything. I was surrendering, little by little, because surrender was easier than being honest." Eleanor watched him carefully, not unkindly, not gently either. "You were your father's son in talent, but not in courage." He closed his eyes at that, and when he opened them again, they were wet. "I know." There it was at last, not performance, not explanation disguised as remorse, simple acknowledgement. "I let her speak about you as if you were an obstacle. I let conversations happen that should have ended the moment your name was mentioned. I told myself nothing had really been done, but I knew what allowing it meant. And on that ship," he stopped, his throat tightening. "When she told you to go below deck and I said nothing, I think some part of me finally saw what I'd become. I just didn't know how to undo it." Eleanor's voice remained even. "Some things cannot be undone." Silence settled between them again, but it was no longer evasive. It was the silence of truth being allowed to stand without decoration. Finally, Daniel said, "I came to say I am sorry, not because I need you to save me, not because I expect reconciliation to look tidy. I came because whether or not you forgive me, I needed to tell you plainly that I failed you, as a son, as a man, as the child of the people who built the name I hid behind." Eleanor studied him for a long time. Then she rose, walked to the window, and looked out toward the harbor. A rescue launch bearing the Trust's provisional insignia had returned that morning from a training exercise. Volunteers were unloading medical crates. One young woman laughed as a gust of wind nearly took her cap. Life moved. Work continued. The world did not pause for damaged family myths. When Eleanor turned back, there was no anger in her face now, only gravity. "I do forgive you," she said. Daniel's shoulders shook once, almost imperceptibly, but before relief could fully form in him, Eleanor continued, "I forgive you because I refuse to spend the rest of my life drinking poison and calling it motherhood. I forgive you because hatred is a chain, and I have worn enough chains for one lifetime. But listen to me very carefully, Daniel." He looked up. "Forgiveness is not restoration. It is not permission. It is not a return to the old arrangement in which I absorb humiliation and call it family. I will not restore your control. I will not step into courtrooms to rescue you from consequences you invited. I will not rebuild the life you helped dismantle. That part is over." Tears slid down his face now, and he did not hide them. "I understand." "I hope so," Eleanor said, "because this is the first honest boundary I should have drawn years ago." He bowed his head. "I'm ashamed." "You should be," she replied. Then, after a beat, her voice softened. "But shame is only useful if it teaches." He left an hour later, quieter than he had arrived. Not redeemed, not ruined beyond repair, simply stripped of illusion. Eleanor watched from the window as he walked down the stone path toward the gate, shoulders bent not from age, but from truth finally carried without assistance. She did not call him back. 3 weeks later, under a bright May sky, the Whitmore Seafarers Trust launched its first rescue and support vessel from the harbor below the estate. It was not enormous, but it was sturdy, beautifully equipped, and staffed by people who understood exactly why it existed. Local families gathered along the quay. Port officials attended. Journalists came. Retired crewmen stood in their old jackets with tears in their eyes. Helena held Eleanor's hand before the ceremony began. Maurice pretended the wind was bothering his eyes. When the master of ceremonies stepped to the podium, his voice carried cleanly across the water. "Today we honor not only a vessel, but a promise that those who spend their lives carrying others across the world will not be forgotten when they themselves need rescue. And we honor the woman whose vision, history, and courage helped bring this promise to life, Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore." Applause rose around the harbor. Not the shallow applause of gala dinners, not the calculated approval of people clapping because status told them to. This was fuller, warmer, rooted in gratitude and respect. Eleanor stepped forward, sunlight catching the silver in her hair, the sea wind lifting the edge of her coat. For one brief instant, she remembered the servant corridor on the cruise ship, the coldness of Vanessa's voice, the silence after the engine stopped, the shock of hearing her own name summoned over the loudspeaker while the whole vessel listened. And she understood, with a peace so complete it almost felt holy, that the worst night of her humiliation had not been the end of her life. It had been the brutal doorway into it.